on this one. It's going to be debated on Friday. Now, I myself have really ruminated over this topic. I think it's a very difficult one. And first of all, I'd say this, as a Christian, I really struggle with the idea of anybody taking anyone else's life. But, you know, I do believe that just because I have my religion, it shouldn't necessarily dictate it for other people. And I have a great amount of sympathy with people with chronic conditions and terminal illnesses. My own amazing late uncle was an MS sufferer, and I believe at one point in time, well, I know at one point in time, he had the Swiss conversation with his family. And when I've done shows like this before and people have called in talking to me about how much they suffer, and if you know you're going to meet your maker, perhaps it's just nice to be able to put in place how and when, make sure the family's all around you, that you get to have your final days as you would choose because you know when they're going to occur. And I have a huge amount of sympathy with that argument as well. But here's where it falls apart for me. It's when you come up with this legislation, who's going to actually enforce it? Who's in charge of this? Well, 2 doctors, a judge. I'm not necessarily sure right now that I entirely trust how the NHS works. First of all, we know it is massively under-resourced and understaffed, and how much time do they have to properly have consultations, have proper patient care where they know the whole backstory of that patient, where they know whether that patient might be coming under psychological duress from family members or environmental circumstances. You know, how much are doctors able to really drill down into the personal circumstances of those in their care at the moment? Then I'm going to give you some more statistics here. Just last year, the NHS received 13,784 legal clinical claims. That's more than 37 a day. So the NHS gets sued once every 40 minutes, right? And you want them to decide whether they can legally end someone's life. I have a bit of a problem with this. Now, we talk about end-of-life care, and for a lot of people, it is unbearable suffering and pain. This is what I hear over and over again. So while the NHS pays out around £2.8 billion every year in compensation for medical negligence, do you know what the government pays towards funding hospices? 350 million. 350 million, a meagre third of what hospices actually need just to basically function. The rest that hospices get, over £1 billion, comes from volunteer staffed charity shops, donations and fundraising. Now you want to put that into perspective as well, that the 350 million compared to the over 2 billion of NHS compensation for making mistakes, the 350 million that they give to end-of-life care, probably the equivalent of putting migrants up in the hotel for about a month. Where are the priorities here? When you look at the judges who make decisions on these things, whether or not it's right that someone should be able to end their life, and, you know, where are those thresholds going to be set? We keep being told the checks and balances are all in place. We now heard this horrible term, good dying. They always love putting a snazzy phrase around things. But when it comes to the judges, right, who might be signing off on these decisions, do you trust them as well? The same judges who overturn deportation rulings for people because they've got a right to a family life. I mean, if we're going to bring in this legislation, do you not just think we should get our house in order first? That's my argument. Let's speak now to Dr Mark Pickering, who's a spokesperson for Care Not Killing. Mark, it's great to have you on the programme. Like I said, I've been very torn over this subject over the course of months. I go back and forth because I understand there are so many people out there, and the argument is that these are people who they know that their life is coming to an end. They know their prognosis is fewer than 6 months, and they just want to manage the circumstances around their passing. And I have a great amount of sympathy with that. Yet, as much as I do, something in my gut just tells me, I don't know, thin end of a wedge, what are we getting ourselves into?
Absolutely. And I think the thin end of the wedge argument is really, really strong, because when you hear, you know, phone-ins and people call in to talk about suffering relatives, and you mentioned your own relative there, many of the people who families describe as being in great suffering, they're not actually terminally ill. They don't have less than 6 months less to live. And this bill, which would intentionally exclude anyone with more than 6 months to live, that's not going to help any of these people. And so many of the people who think, well, hey, this is going to be, you know, the end of our suffering, it's not. Actually, we still have to learn to deal with suffering. We still have to have a health system and a social security system that actually manages that. And that's not going to be the answer to people. And when we talk about the figures, there's new polling out that says, 65% of the public back assisted dying. If you look at Dignity in Dying, who's the main group behind this bill, their website still says 84% of the public support it. Now, they're not going to amend that to say, oh dear, a 20% drop in support for assisted dying. They want to keep those nice big figures high there. Now, the new figures also say that 75% of people don't think that the NHS is fit to cope with this. And I would absolutely agree with that. And we need to listen to Wes Streeting, the Health and Social Care Secretary, who's also said the same thing, that palliative care, as you said, it's underfunded. It's brilliant when it's there, but for so many people, it doesn't actually get to them in time. There are thousands of people who die every year who could have really benefited from good palliative care, but didn't. And that's what's cruel, and that's what's broken.
My other concern here, OK, so we know the legislation is for people with fewer than 6 months to live. Now, my problem with this is, how does anyone know? Because very often, and I don't think it's like, oh, very rarely this happens. I think very often it happens that someone's given months to live and it's a lot longer, or someone's given years to live and it's a lot less. And doctors do their best to try and come up with accurate prognoses, but it's actually very difficult to do. And my concern, therefore, is someone with 6 months left to live, who are having to sort of be able to demonstrate indubitably that they've only got 6 months left to live. If the courts go, well, actually, we're not sure that this is the case for you, are they then wasting 6 months of their lives rather than enjoying those 6 months, or as much as they could do, stuck in legal battles? I just think so much of this is complex, that so much of this is all very well bringing the legislation in and saying, well, let's just see what happens. Let's just see in the rollout where the weak spots are. This is legislation on giving people the right to kill somebody else. Let's not mince our words. Now, it is the act of killing, OK? The human body hasn't decided. It might be sort of everyone's dying every second of the day. None of us, have the rest of eternity to live. So the human body itself sort of tries to self-sustain. This is actually giving somebody the right to end a life, to kill somebody. This isn't a small matter. This isn't just like, well, we'll bring the legislation, and we've seen what's gone wrong in Canada, where way too many people are being pressured to die. We've seen what's gone wrong in the Netherlands, where now young women in their 20s who say they've got depression are choosing to end their lives. We're not going to do that. It's just going to be these few people here who definitely know they're going to die within 6 months. The problem is, the minute you bring in this legislation, it'll be, well, I'm going to be living 8 months, so I want to be able to get this, or it just opens the door for things to get pretty ugly pretty quickly.
And if you ask any doctor who does this kind of thing, they'll tell you can't estimate it. You can't put a finger on when somebody will die. And so many people say, oh, well, the doctor said I had 3 months to live and I'm still here 15 months later. Or they said I had 6 months, or they said my mum had 6 months left to live and she was gone within 2 weeks. It's just guesswork at best. So what you're going to have is actually lots of doctors being put under pressure by people or by relatives to say, but might they perhaps die within 6 months? Could you say perhaps, possibly? And people will just be pressurized to relax the criterion, to expand them, to fudge things, which is exactly what happens in other countries. And then this legislation proposal says that a judge will be able to sign it off. Now, it sounds great, but judges are often saying that's not what we're here for. We're not there to work out whether someone's being coerced or whether this process is being applied correctly. And the former president of the Family Division of the High Court looked at the numbers, the 3% of deaths estimated by Kim Leadbeater, and he said, well, if you do 2 hours per case, 17,000 deaths a year, that's going to be 34,000 hours of High Court judge time. There's only actually 19,000 hours of High Court Family Division judges right now, and the courts are overwhelmed. Right. So where's that going to come from?
This is it. All of the checks and balances, all these approvals, the doctors, the judges. Like I said, my concern more than anything is we just don't have the public trust in our institutions, and we don't have the correct infrastructure to make sure that this is applied appropriately. Yet at the same time, I am deeply sympathetic with people who suffer chronically. But I think it's important we have this conversation now, because at the very least, I think what might happen is we, rather than be too British and not want to talk about death, it knocks at all of our doors at some point, that perhaps we need to have a conversation about making sure our loved ones are looked after, that they're comfortable, to start planning for things like this, to make sure that people have fulfilling and enriched lives right up to their final breath.